The order came through the Conclave's official channels at 0300 hours, Coordinated Galactic Time. It was not a declaration of war. War required a declaration. War implied that both sides had been given an opportunity to negotiate. This was not a negotiation. The directive, transmitted simultaneously to every Conclave-affiliated species, contained 4 words that would reshape the trajectory of human history: Earth Extinction Event Authorized. The document that followed the directive was remarkably efficient. It detailed the reasoning. It presented evidence. It explained the logic. And by the time the last species received the transmission, the decision had already been made by a vote of 39 species against 1 human abstention. Humanity was to be removed from the galaxy. Not conquered. Not restricted. Not subordinated. Removed. Erased. Rendered extinct. The reasoning, as presented by High Conclave Chancellor Vorthack, was clinical. Humanity has demonstrated a pattern of territorial expansion incompatible with peaceful coexistence. Human technological advancement is accelerating beyond predictable parameters. Human behavioral patterns suggest inevitable conflict with established powers. The Conclave, in its commitment to galactic stability, has determined that allowing humanity to continue its current trajectory poses an unacceptable risk. Extinction of the human species is therefore authorized. Implementation to begin within 6 months. All Conclave members are encouraged to contribute resources and military assets to this objective. The vote was not close. Only Earth's single representative voted to abstain. The other 38 species voted unanimously. Humanity had been sentenced to death by bureaucratic procedure. Admiral Sarah Chen had been stationed at the outer reaches of human space when the order came through. She was commanding the Artemis, the last of Earth's deep space exploration vessels, along with a small fleet of support ships and civilian research stations. It was not a military position. Earth had not maintained a serious military capability for 30 years. The Conclave's insistence on non-proliferation had been so effective that humanity had largely disarmed itself. The Artemis was technically a civilian science vessel, though it carried enough defensive capabilities to fend off pirate attacks. It would be utterly useless against a Conclave extinction fleet. Chen was 67 years old. She had spent her entire career in space, watching the stars from increasingly sophisticated instruments. She had wanted to die somewhere out here, surrounded by the cosmic dust and the ancient light of distant suns. Instead, she was about to watch her entire species be murdered. When the message reached her, transmitted by Earth Defense Command in an encrypted burst that had taken 3 hours to cross the distance, she read it once and then did something that would surprise the few people who understood what it meant. She ordered the Artemis to jump. Not to Earth. Not toward human space. Away. Into the deep void. Toward a region of space so remote that even Conclave deep space mapping efforts had only touched it peripherally. Admiral, her communications officer said carefully, Earth Command is requesting clarification of your heading. Send them a message, Chen said quietly. Tell them I received their transmission. Tell them I understand the situation. And tell them I'm going to do what I should have done 30 years ago. She paused. Tell them I'm going to come home. The Conclave's extinction fleet assembled itself over the course of 3 months. It was not the largest military force ever assembled. That distinction belonged to the Wars of the Breaking, 30 years ago. But it was efficient. Concentrated. Designed not for conquest but for total annihilation. 300 capital ships. 14,000 support vessels. Weapons platforms. Drone carriers. Systematic execution tools. The fleet was commanded by Grand Admiral Sovic, the same military officer who had nearly defeated humanity in the Breaking Wars. He had learned from that experience. His fleet was positioned to prevent any human ship from escaping, to prevent any human colony from being evacuated, to ensure that the extinction would be total. There was no escape. There was no resistance possible. There was only the inevitable advance of the machinery of extinction. The first strikes came against the outer colonies. Mars Station reported the approaching fleet and sent out an evacuation order. There was nowhere to evacuate to. The Conclave had blockaded every possible escape route. Within hours, Mars Station went silent. The settlements on the moons of Jupiter transmitted final messages.
Their children played music in the background. They knew what was coming.
There was a strange dignity in those final transmissions, a quiet acceptance of inevitable death.
Venus colony attempted to mount a defense.
They had some old military equipment, weapons left over from the breaking.
It was swatted aside like a mosquito attacking a human. The colony's population of 40,000 was erased in 17 minutes.
On Earth itself, the government issued feudal orders.
Prepare for defense. Evacuate the coasts. Move populations underground. All of it was meaningless.
The extinction fleet would arrive in 3 months. There was no hiding from something that had the resources to glass an entire planet.
The population of Earth fell into a strange state of suspended unreality. People continued going to work. Children continued going to school. Parents continued making plans for futures that would never arrive.
It was not denial, exactly.
It was something deeper than that.
A species that had never seriously contemplated its own extinction struggling to process the reality of it. And in the void between the stars, Admiral Sarah Chen raced toward home. The Artemis had not been designed for speed. It was a research vessel, built for careful observation and detailed study, not for rapid transit. Its jump drive was efficient but not powerful. Its journey toward Earth would take months, even with maximum energy expenditure. Chen pushed it beyond those parameters. She requisitioned every bit of fuel from her support ships. She overclocked the jump drive to dangerous levels. She mapped a route through unstable spatial regions that a sane captain would never attempt. And she drove toward Earth like she was racing something that terrified her. Because she was.
In the months of her return journey, Chen had become obsessed with a single question: why?
The Conclave's reasoning for the extinction order had been presented as logical.
Humanity's expansion was too rapid. Humanity's technological advancement was too accelerated. Humanity posed a theoretical threat to galactic stability.
But Chen had spent her entire career studying things carefully. And when she examined that reasoning carefully, something did not align. 30 years ago, during the breaking wars, humanity had proven far more militarily capable than the Conclave had anticipated. Humanity had held its own against species that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Humanity had developed tactics and technologies that had surprised the finest military minds in the Conclave.
And then, after the breaking wars ended, humanity had voluntarily disarmed.
They had given up weapons development. They had submitted to Conclave oversight. They had become one of the most compliant species in the entire galactic structure.
So why would the Conclave suddenly decide that humanity was a threat? Unless the threat was not about what humanity was doing in the present. Unless the threat was about what humanity might become in the future. And unless the Conclave had determined that possibility was unacceptable.
Chen began to understand, during those months of travel, that the Conclave had never been particularly interested in justice or peace or galactic stability. Those were the words they used. Those were the frameworks they operated within. But the fundamental truth was simpler: the Conclave was afraid. They were afraid of species that could challenge their dominance. They had eliminated such species before, when necessary. And they were afraid of humanity in particular because humans had something that most species lacked: adaptability, creativity, the ability to solve problems through innovation rather than pure power. The Conclave had decided that humanity was too dangerous to exist. And they had decided to eliminate that danger before it could fully manifest.
Chen realized that she understood what she needed to do.
It was not a pleasant realization. It was not a comfortable realization.
It was, however, the only realization that made any sense.
The Artemis emerged from jump space at the edge of the Sol system to find the extinction fleet already in position.
200 capital ships formed a blockade around Earth. They were not attacking yet. They were waiting. The extinction was supposed to be total. Sobeck had positioned his fleet to catch any human ships attempting to escape. He was patient. Efficient. He was not expecting one small research vessel to suddenly appear at the edge of his formation.
Chen pushed the Artemis at maximum velocity toward the Conclave blockade. Her communications officer was already sending out distress signals on all frequencies.
"Admiral," the communications officer said, "I'm receiving hails from the Conclave fleet.
They're demanding we identify ourselves and ignore them, Chen ordered.
Keep transmitting on all frequencies. Tell every human on Earth that I'm coming. Tell them the Artemis is here.
The captain of the lead conclave vessel, a Dven commander named Sarvik, watched the small human ship approaching and could not make sense of what he was seeing.
Destroy it, he ordered.
But Chen had anticipated that. The Artemis dove into an asteroid field at the edge of the system, using the rocks as cover, moving in a pattern that was erratic and unpredictable.
She knew her ship better than any conclave officer could hope to. She knew its limitations. She knew its capabilities. And she knew how to buy time.
The conclave ships pursued, firing at the Artemis with weapons designed to annihilate capital ships.
The small research vessel, never designed for combat, should have been destroyed in seconds. Instead, it danced between the asteroids like a living thing.
It banked and weaved and accelerated in patterns that seemed to defy physics.
Weapon after weapon missed.
Not because Chen was a better pilot than her pursuers, but because she had something more important than skill. She had nothing to lose. A captain who is trying to survive makes calculated decisions. A captain who has accepted that survival is impossible makes decisions based on pure necessity. Chen had accepted her death the moment the extinction order had been issued. She was flying now not to survive, but to accomplish what needed to be accomplished before she died. The Artemis fired its defensive systems, clearing a path through the asteroid field. It accelerated toward Earth with the conclave fleet in hot pursuit. And on Earth below, every screen, every communication device, every human consciousness that had any access to external transmission received a single message, Admiral Sarah Chen's voice, broadcast across all frequencies. I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the Earth Defense Command. I have returned from deep space. I am here to tell you that we are not alone in our final hours. I am here to tell you that there is still one human warship in the galaxy. I am here to tell you that Earth will not die without a fight.
The message repeated. It would repeat for the next 18 hours.
And in those 18 hours, something would shift in the human consciousness.
From resignation to defiance.
From acceptance to resistance.
From the passive waiting for extinction to active preparation for war. Grand Admiral Sarvik watched the Artemis break through his blockade and approach Earth's upper atmosphere with what could only be described as fury.
All ships, pursue, he ordered. I want that vessel destroyed before it makes landfall.
But something unexpected happened. As the Artemis descended toward Earth, human ships began launching from the surface. Not military vessels.
These were civilian ships.
Transports. Cargo haulers. Research platforms. Anything with a propulsion system.
Thousands of them, launching in a coordinated pattern that Sarvik's tactical systems had not predicted.
They were not launching to escape.
They were launching to protect the Artemis.
Humans were deliberately positioning their ships between the conclave fleet and the descending admiral. They were not soldiers.
They were civilians.
Families. Researchers. Construction workers.
People who had no military training and no weapons. They were sacrificing themselves.
Sarvik had expected many things from the humans. Surrender. Escape attempts. Perhaps even coordinated military resistance.
What he had not expected was willing sacrifice. Target the approaching civilian ships, he ordered. His weapons batteries opened fire. The civilians died by the thousands.
Mothers and fathers and children. People who had never wanted to be soldiers. People who had never wanted to die in space. But more ships kept coming. Because Admiral Chen's message had activated something primal in the human consciousness.
Something that transcended logic or strategy or survival calculus. It had activated the will to fight.
Even knowing they would lose. Even knowing they would die.
Humans were launching themselves at a force that could erase them with contempt. And they were doing it because one admiral had told them that surrender was still a choice. And they were choosing not to surrender. The Artemis touched down on Earth in a remote facility in what had once been called the Rocky Mountains. Admiral Chen stepped out of her ship into a world that was ending. The sky above was filled with conclave ships. The ground around her facility was being bombarded by precision strikes that left craters where cities had been.
She had perhaps 12 hours before the extinction fleet would complete its bombardment.
perhaps 12 hours before Earth and everything on it ceased to exist. She walked into the command center and found Commander Marcus Vale waiting for her.
Vale was older now.
The years since the broadcast incident had left their mark on him. But his eyes were sharp.
Focused. "Admiral," he said simply. "Welcome home."
"Marcus," Chen replied. "I received fragmentary reports about what you did 30 years ago.
The broadcast.
The exposure of the conclave."
"Yes. I'm here to do something similar," Chen said. "But different. I don't have evidence to expose. I don't have truth to broadcast. I have something simpler." She paused. "I have proof that we can fight."
Vale looked at the tactical displays showing the Conclave Extinction fleet in overwhelming position above them.
"The Artemis is one ship, Admiral."
"They have 300 capital ships."
"Yes," Chen agreed. "But the Artemis will not be fighting alone."
Every civilian who launched a ship into that blockade proved something.
Humans don't have to be soldiers to resist.
Humans don't have to follow strategic logic to refuse to die quietly. She activated the command channel, broadcasting to every human still alive on Earth and in the orbiting colonies.
"This is Admiral Sarah Chen," she said. "I know the Extinction fleet is overwhelming.
I know the strategic situation is hopeless.
I know that by any rational calculation, we are finished." She paused, letting that sink in. "I am asking you to choose irrationality. I am asking you to choose hope. Not because it will save us, but because choosing hope in the face of extinction is what makes us human."
What happened in the next 12 hours became the most studied period in human history. The Artemis, fully operational and crewed by volunteers who knew they were going to die, began firing at the Conclave fleet from orbit. It was absurd. One ship against 300 should have resulted in total destruction within minutes. But the Artemis had something that the Conclave ships did not. It had nothing to protect except its own continuation.
Every shield, every weapon, every resource was focused on maximum offensive and defensive capability.
And on Earth below, something even more impossible was happening.
Humans were building weapons. Not sophisticated weapons. Not weapons that would win a war. But weapons that could hurt. Weapons that could damage. Weapons that could make the Conclave pay a price for every city they destroyed. Improvised explosives.
Directed energy weapons.
Kinetic accelerators.
Crewed by galactic standards, but built with the particular efficiency that desperation inspires.
The humans were not trying to win. They were trying to make the Conclave understand that genocide was not free. For every human city that the Conclave destroyed, the Artemis damaged a capital ship.
For every human life erased, human hands reached up into the sky and reached back with fire.
The Conclave fleet, designed for the systematic destruction of a defenseless species, found itself in an actual war. Admiral Sovic watched his casualty reports with growing alarm.
His losses were small, measured in single ships and handful of fighters.
Against a fleet of 300, they were negligible. But they were losses. Real losses. Against an opponent that was supposed to be completely defenseless. And more troubling, the humans were not attempting escape.
They were not attempting to surrender and negotiate. They were fighting with a tenacity that suggested they believed they could win.
Sovic did not understand humans. That was becoming increasingly apparent. While the battle raged, Admiral Chen did something that surprised everyone, including herself.
She called a broadcast.
Not to the humans. Not to Earth.
To the Conclave itself. She requested a communications channel to High Conclave Chancellor Vorthak directly.
The request was granted, perhaps out of curiosity. Perhaps out of a desire to hear the Extinction's final moments. Admiral Chen's image appeared on Vorthak's personal screen.
"Chancellor," Chen said simply.
"I want you to understand what you're looking at."
She showed him data.
Tactical displays of human defensive positions. Inventories of improvised weapons. Population distributions and resistance patterns. But more importantly, she showed him something else.
She showed him humanity's response to the extinction order.
Not surrender. Not despair. Not evacuation attempts. Defiance.
Millions of humans, most of whom had never held a weapon before, had volunteered to die fighting. They had built weapons in the hours before extinction. They had taken positions knowing they would be destroyed. They had chosen resistance because the alternative, quiet death, was unacceptable.
You ordered our extinction, Chen said quietly. You assumed we would comply.
You assumed we would die quietly, as befits a subordinate species being removed by its superiors.
She leaned forward. What you're discovering is that humans don't comply with extinction. We resist. Not because we believe we'll win,
but because the act of resistance itself is a form of victory.
You can kill us, Chancellor. But you cannot kill our will to fight. Vortak was silent. Chen continued, I'm not asking you to stop. I know you won't. The vote has already been taken. The conclave has already committed. But I'm asking you to understand what you're doing. You're not eliminating a threat. You're creating a legend.
You're turning humanity into something that will echo through galactic history as the species that refused to die quietly.
The transmission ended.
The Extinction fleet maintained its bombardment for 7 more days. By the end of those 7 days, 200,000 humans were dead.
3 conclave capital ships had been destroyed. Entire cities had been reduced to ash.
But something unexpected had happened in those 7 days.
News of the human resistance had spread throughout the galaxy.
Species that had voted for extinction began to receive transmissions from their own citizens asking if they had understood what they were voting for.
Human resistance was not military resistance, it was existential resistance.
It was the refusal to accept the conclave's authority to determine which species should live and which should die.
And that message resonated.
Within the conclave itself, cracks began to form. Species that had voted for extinction began to wonder if that vote had been wise.
The humans were not being eliminated cleanly and efficiently.
Instead, the extinction process was becoming a conflict.
A war. Something that required ongoing resources and commitment. And for what?
The humans posed no serious threat. They had been subdued for 30 years. They were not expanding aggressively. Their technological advancement, while notable, was not dramatically faster than other species. The real threat, some species began to argue, was not the humans themselves. The real threat was what the conclave had become if it ordered extinctions based on theoretical future threats. 23 days after Admiral Chen returned to Earth, the conclave called for a vote. The motion was simple: to halt the extinction and return to diplomatic negotiation with the human species.
The vote was closer than the original extinction authorization.
14 species voted to continue.
24 voted to halt. The extinction fleet was ordered to stand down. Admiral Sovic received the order with something between relief and frustration.
He had destroyed a planet's worth of human infrastructure and killed a significant percentage of the human population. But the war was ending not in total victory but in something that looked uncomfortably like a stalemate. He did not understand that the humans had not won a military victory. They had won something more important. They had won the right to continue existing. The human conclave peace negotiations lasted 14 months. The terms were harsh on humanity. Earth was required to pay reparations for damages caused during the resistance.
Human space was restricted to prevent further expansion. Human military development was placed under strict conclave oversight.
But humanity was not extinct.
And that, incredibly, was enough. Admiral Chen sat in the negotiation chamber in the final session, signing the treaty that would bind humanity to stricter restrictions than ever before.
A representative from the Sauriath species approached her afterward.
Why, the Sauriath asked. Why resist when you knew you would lose? Chen looked at the alien carefully. Because losing with dignity is better than winning through surrender, she said. We lost this battle. But we won the knowledge that we could fight. And we proved to the galaxy that the conclave's authority is not absolute.
The Sauriath considered this.
The conclave will remember this.
They will be more careful about authorizing extinctions in the future.
I know, Chen agreed.
And that's worth the price we paid. In her final months, Admiral Chen recorded a message to be transmitted to every human colony, every human settlement, every human being scattered across human space.
I am Admiral Sarah Chen, she said.
30 years ago, I left Earth in command of a research vessel. I went into the deep void and stayed there while my species was marked for extinction.
She paused.
I came back not because I had a plan to save us.
I came back because coming back was what Admiral of the human fleet should do.
I came back because one person refusing to accept extinction can inspire a species to refuse extinction.
She looked directly into the camera.
We paid a terrible price for our resistance.
Millions died. Cities were destroyed. We are now more restricted than we have ever been under conclave rule.
Another pause. But we are still here. And that simple fact, that we still exist, that we still have a future, that the galaxy can no longer treat humanity as disposable, is worth the cost.
She smiled. I am an old woman.
I will not see the day when humanity is truly free from conclave restrictions.
But I will see the day when my species looks at the extinction order as a memory. As a warning about how close we came.
As a lesson about what it costs to exist in a galaxy that does not want you to exist.
The message ended.
50 years later, High Ward North, an ancient observer who had witnessed nearly 500 years of galactic history, stood in a historical archive examining records of the extinction order and the human resistance. It was, by any military standard, a minor conflict. The human casualties amounted to less than 1% of the galactic population.
The conclave losses were even smaller.
In the grand scheme of galactic warfare, it registered as barely significant. And yet, historians argued, it had changed everything.
Because the human resistance had established a precedent. Species could resist extinction. Species could refuse to accept the conclave's authority.
Species could fight back, even against overwhelming odds, and emerge with their right to exist intact. After the human resistance, 3 other species had voted down extinction orders. 7 had negotiated their way out of forced subordination. The conclave's authority had been fundamentally weakened.
Not destroyed, but weakened. And Earth understood that weakening was not the result of military defeat.
The conclave had not lost to the humans. The conclave had lost to the idea that the humans represented. The idea that surrender was always a choice. The idea that every species, no matter how small or how weak, had the right to refuse extinction. The idea that the conclave, for all its power, could not actually force compliance through terror alone.
Earth wrote in his personal records, Admiral Sarah Chen did not save humanity through superior strategy.
She saved humanity by forcing the galaxy to understand that saving was necessary. By refusing to die quietly, she made humanity's survival everyone's problem, not just humanity's problem. The conclave, in seeking to eliminate a theoretical threat, created a very real political problem. And Chen understood that political problems are far harder to solve than military ones.
He paused. The extinction order marked a turning point in galactic history.
Not because it was the most powerful military action ever undertaken, but because it was the first time the conclave's authority was seriously challenged by a species it had already subdued.
That challenge did not destroy the conclave,
but it set it on a path toward eventual reformation.
The galaxy will take centuries to understand what happened in those 23 days.
But when it does, it will recognize Admiral Sarah Chen not as a military victor, but as the catalyst for galactic transformation.